Just a moment. No, no. Oh,
Gosh,
yes. Okay.
do you have to say good morning
Gosh,
again?
yes. Good morning. Yes. You need to say that one again. Yes. Good morning, Timothy, and thank you for joining us. Where are you joining us from now? Once
I'm
again,
joining you
please.
from the southern tip of Oshima, which is a large island off the coast of Tokyo. It actually belongs to Tokyo proper. It's a big island you can sometimes see on a clear day from places in Tokyo. But I
Great.
sailed here yesterday with Evan Burkowski.
And Evan is there. So, good
Evan is here
morning to
with me.
Evan too. Yes, he's enjoying sitting behind you and probably helping you with the content, I hope.
He's just making faces and trying to divert my attention from what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right. So thank you really for joining. To everybody who is on Clubhouse right now, if you watch the live stream on LinkedIn or on YouTube, you will be able to enjoy the scenery behind Timothy. So like every week, we are here at 8:20, live streaming on two platforms, YouTube and LinkedIn. And Timothy is with us to let us know what has happened in Japanese politics during the past 1 week. There has been a lot going on internationally, internally, and also internationally. So we're going to have about 30-minute briefing here on LinkedIn and Clubhouse and also YouTube. And after that, we're going to move entirely to Clubhouse for the discussion. So please join us when we do that with comments, questions, observations. And at the moment, for this, at this moment, sorry, I'm going to let Timothy talk because he is on his boat and we should, yes, try to finish, yes, the briefing quite soon. Otherwise, it may jump forward. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya, and good morning, everybody who is in our LinkedIn audience, on our YouTube channel, and also on Clubhouse who are listening live. I'm coming to you live from downtown Oshima. That's not really true. Oshima is an island right off the coast of Tokyo. I'm on the southern tip in a small harbor called Habu Harbor. Um, I sailed here yesterday from Shimoda, and we'll sail from here to Katsuyama, the home port on Chiba, after we finish this briefing. That'll be about a 4 or 5 hour sail today. Winds are nice. The sea is somewhat calm as we are right now. And every week we come to you, whether I'm in a harbor or standing in the rain, to give you a briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics that is important to you. So I really appreciate you staying tuned, and I really try hard to give you the information that's meaningful and that is indicative of how business is going to go, helps you make decisions for you or your company, and gives you insight into what's going on, so that you can have really good conversations with your Japanese friends, and also just informing people who are in the United States about what's going on here. So today, without any further ado, I'd like to get into today's briefing. I'm going to talk about 8 different topics and wrap up with what's going on with the elections that are less than 3 months away. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan, Ukraine, what's going on with Mr. Kishida, his approval ratings, what kind of forces are weighing down and making him act and speak publicly on certain issues. I want to talk about the economy. The economy is really starting to take a front seat with the U.S. With the yen valuation continued to tumble. I want to talk about Japan's defense posture, the different policies that they're taking. It seems to be a shift in Japan's defense policy. There's a lot of rhetoric there. It looks like it will be followed up with operational packages and budget and different defense capabilities. There's an awful lot going on there. I want to talk about COVID and the reentry requirements. There's been some movement there. U.S.-Japan relations, always an important part whenever we're talking about Japan. Quad is the 4 nations: Australia, United States, Japan, and India. There's been a little bit of movement there. I want to talk about Mr. Abe and what he's doing. A lot of people ask me, so he's been awful quiet. What's going on with him, Langley? And I'd like to address that. And then I'd like to go into the elections, which are less than 3 months away. There's a lot of maneuvering going on, uh, not only within the LDP, but within the opposition parties too, and some of the opposition parties who are maybe not opposition parties after all until maybe the election finishes. So let me just jump right into it. Japan, Ukraine relations are really taking a new turn. Mr. Hayashi, the foreign minister, was in Poland just this last week. We reported on this in our show last week about him going there and his intention of bringing back about 20 refugees with him on a government-sponsored airplane. That's a pretty big deal. Japanese policy pretty much restricts the use of Japanese government material and self-defense forces for transporting foreigners, not Japanese nationals. So that's why during uh, the war in the Middle East, there was a lot of action there, but very few refugees or evacuees were brought in. Now that policy seems to have changed. The foreign minister returned with 20 refugees, and it is just the beginning of a larger program. Currently, there are about 460 Ukrainian refugees that have come to Japan. The latest batch, some of them, the 20 that came with the foreign minister, are not necessarily people who have relatives or close knit kin in Japan. So the 460 that are here now all had some relatives living here. They had some sort of a technical bond with Japan. And the policy is changing now to allow not just them, but also people who are unaffiliated with Japan. There was even I think, a 16-year-old girl who came with the foreign minister this last week. Japan has committed to providing yet another $100 million, that's dollars, not yen, in the evacuation and in the support of the humanitarian efforts there. Japan is somewhat restricted in providing defense capabilities, but it is really going whole hog on the humanitarian. And this 100 million that they've just earmarked this week is in addition to another 100 million that was earmarked at the beginning of the Russian invasion. So there is a lot going on there. This week, the Diet discussed about what they're going to do with this amount of money that they've earmarked for the humanitarian aid. And the decisions that have come out is rebuilding Ukraine, removing landmines, removing rubble, helping the evacuation of refugees, helping them. And along with the G7 countries, it appears that they've made a major commitment among all of them to take care of the refugees who want to go. So the doors are open. It's almost as if a red carpet treatment is being extended to the Ukrainian refugees. Free language training, helping them find a job. More than 500 residences are prepared for them. So it's really remarkable, given Japan's typical posture towards refugees of any nationality. This is a huge leap. The travel restrictions for the Ukrainian refugees has been remarkably relaxed, so that when they come in, even if they the testing for COVID. So normally when people come into Japan, they have to have the visa, the passports for the vaccines, lots of different things, jump through lots of hoops. Even now, people complain about the amount of time that's required in Haneda or in Narita to just come in, even though they've got the authorizations. For the Ukrainian refugees, that's been largely relaxed. So it is interesting that we've got kind of a two-system approach here, one for the refugees and one for everybody else. And there's a little bit more news on the entry restrictions that have been relaxed further. Mr. Kishida is really on a roll here. He's fortunate. We've talked about his approval rating, how bad it was initially, and he's now 6 months into his job. And fortuitously to him, he's really dedicated. He's had to dedicate a lot of time on foreign policy, on foreign affairs, because of the Ukrainian crisis, and it's kind of an escape for national leaders. Whenever they're in trouble domestically, they go internationally. It's an easier way to pick up numbers. But here it's real. Kishida has taken the Japan approach to sanctions against Russia, the treatment of evacuees, and the amount of money that is being dedicated really enthusiastically. And as a consequence of that, has really developed a better profile and an appreciation among the Japanese people, the Japanese voters. It shows him being more integrated with the G7 countries, and having him in that kind of international spotlight is good for him. It's good for the atmospherics and the dynamics of being an international politician. And so as a consequence of that, even though Mr. Suga, at this same period of time, 6 months into the administration, Mr. Suga's approval rating was at about 48%. Mr. Kishida's approval rating right now is right at 60%. So he's made tremendous progress, even in the last four weeks when we've been following this very closely in lead up to the upper house elections. He also doesn't have Mr. Abe fighting against him as much as he normally would have. Mr. Abe's had to take a little bit of a backseat for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to go into those later in my briefing. But one of the things that he was afraid of is he's got a bit of a fight with Mr. Abe for a lot of different reasons. Mr. Abe holds a lot of political power. He's got the largest political faction, as you know. So fortuitously for Mr. Kishida, the other issues, COVID, Ukraine, the Russian invasion, have all benefited Mr. Kishida. So his approval rating continues to go up. He's working hard on establishing himself as a different kind of prime minister than Mr. Abe was. The lower house just passed this on Friday, the economic security legislation. That's the hallmark of the Kishida administration. It is the first important bill to pass through. It was something that he proposed. It touches, how Japan protects itself from economic espionage, from IP theft, from actually endorsing the collaboration of public-private partnerships on developing intellectual property. So it's a pretty big deal. It will now go to the upper house. It's likely to be passed pretty swiftly. It will be law probably by this time next week. I'll report on that. The elections are coming up in less than 3 months. I've got a piece just at the end of this briefing that talks specifically about that. But the fact that Mr. Kishida is doing so well in the polls compels him to actually be a little bit more expansive, a little bit more bold in some of his pronouncements. So you can anticipate him being a little bit more vocal and a little bit more in the press. The economy is not doing so great, unfortunately, for him. Mr. Kuroda, who is the chairman of the Bank of Japan, was called into the Diet. He made a presentation there. The yen hit 125 yen to the dollar. It's falling. That's really good for people who are exporting, but it's not so good for people who live here and depend on inputs from abroad, which Japan really depends on, particularly energy inputs, but also food and different things like that. So the economy is not doing so great. Mr. Kuroda is fighting hard to keep the yen strong, keeping the bond market stable. Japan is an attractive market for people who are trying to protect their money. The fluctuations here are not as volatile as in other countries. But once you see the yen starting to vacillate like this, it becomes a very poignant signal that it could go much higher. Japan has the worst debt ratio of any of the countries. It's 256 times the debt of what the GDP is every year. And that's pretty amazing. The United States has the largest debt comparatively, but for Japan, for the GDP to be that much, I mean, so much is devoted to debt servicing. And in light of that, you've got the yen-dollar relationship that seems to be going squirrely. It doesn't bode well for Japanese consumers. We're leading up to the election. The Japanese government has to do something. They're coming up with a supplemental budget. There's a bit of a fight there. More money, throw more money into the economy, give people hope, encourage them to spend more money. I don't know if people are going to buy that, but with the election coming, people need to feel good about what the LDP is doing and what Mr. Kishida's administration is doing, because if they don't win, or if they don't, I mean, winning is a matter of degree, but if Mr. Kishida doesn't do as well as the last time the upper house went into an election period, he could be seeing, the knives starting to come out. So he's got to really dance a very delicate dance here, and the economy is not cooperating with him. In defense, there's been a couple of pronouncements. You probably heard about this earlier in the week, where the idea was forwarded that Japan needs to have base strike or first strike capabilities. Base strike or first strike are different concepts. Base strike is to be able to attack and hit a base that has launched a missile. So first of all is, getting the missiles while they're in mid-flight, a difficult job in any event. I think they have the capabilities for that, but also to punish the area that launched the missile. So that's in discussion. First strike is in anticipation of a strike being made to attack that site. The discussion now is on base strike, and there are two parts of that. One is that in the event that a missile is launched that looks like it's heading towards Japanese territorial property, land, the economic security zone, that it receives a retaliation to that base. The other part of that argument is that it's not just the base, but it's also the support and the supply portion of that base. So it would be municipal areas or where people are living, working, who live and work and support that kind of missile firing. So you can see that that's a more expansive view. And then thirdly is the first strike capabilities. So Mr. Kishi, who is, as I guess everybody knows, Mr. Abe's younger brother, he's defense minister, and he's promoting not only a vastly increased budget for defense next year, but also for the capabilities to do this sort of thing. Usually, Mr. Abe is seen as a little bit more hawkish than Mr. Kishida, actually more than just a little bit. But Mr. Kishida is being forced to reconcile his rather peaceful tendencies to account for what's going on in North Korea. They had two launches, you might remember, a couple of weeks ago. They had the first launch that failed in mid-flight, and it distributed debris over the capital city. So everybody in the capital city saw that this flight went up, the rocket went up, everybody was clapping, and then it exploded and debris came down. Less than a week later, he launched another missile, a hypersonic missile, it was said, and it landed in Japan's economic security zone, exclusive economic zone. And this is viewed as very provocative by the Japanese, obviously, but it looks like there's a little bit more of a dynamic going on there. As a consequence of the failed launch, North Korea had to launch a second one and clap it up because they had all these videos of our great leader, launching this missile, and they had a video. It looked almost like something on YouTube. So they had to come up with something, and it turns out the analysis reveals that the second launch was just somewhat of a ploy. It was something to take over for the failure of the first launch and to cover that up and to make a big celebration. So there's a lot going on in North Korea, but also it triggers a lot going on here. And also as an aside, something to keep an eye out for, if you've been watching the news, the defense minister is not looking particularly chipper these days. He, when he gives a press conference, he must sit down. He's walking with a cane, and his countenance, his complexion his complexion is not looking altogether so great. So there could be some changes there, especially in a ministerial portfolio like defense. You want somebody vibrant and strong and projecting an image of strength. It looks like there might be a little bit of a change there that could affect not only the cabinet standing, but also this little tit-a-tat between Mr. Abe and Mr. Kishida. Also, the Japanese nation needs to counter a potential threat from China. It is in 2-on-2 discussions with the Philippines. That just happened this week. So this 2-to-2 convention that has been launched, it initially was launched by the United States. That means the foreign minister and the defense minister meet with their counterparts. This has really started to take on a life of its own. Initially, Quad was established kind of for that kind of defensive posture against China. With what's going on in India, it's not going as robustly as they had hoped. We can talk a little bit about that. But on the defense minister and the foreign minister, that seems to be picking up great steam. So they had this 2-on-2 meeting with the Philippines just this last week. And so far, it's about 6 nations that Japan has established this relationship with the U.S., with Indonesia, with Australia, with Britain, Germany, India, France, and interestingly enough, with Russia. I don't know how much longer that's going to go, but this is all designed to be a bulwark against potential Chinese incursions in the islands in the South Pacific, and particularly Hong Kong, and also Taiwan. So China has its own problems, but in the meantime, Japan needs to really double down on its defense capabilities. The United States is a little bit concerned because in any kind of conflict, Japan is going to be involved. The bases where the United States would host and launch many of the defensive capabilities is basically located in Okinawa, Guam, in some parts of Japan too. And if some conflict happened, it would require the Japanese Diet to authorize certain things. And there's not a lot of confidence that the Japanese Diet would act as swiftly or as robustly or even as accommodating as the situation might call for. Frequently when Japan gets into situations like this, it just takes a long time. They finally get to the right solution or the right decision, but it just takes an enormous amount of time. In light of this constant discussion about revising the Constitution, it just never dies. The Kishida administration is committed to achieving that, and they've assigned Mr. Abe as the main spokesman for this revise the Constitution kind of theme. He spoke in Yamagata just this last week, very passionate, his fist pounding about revising the Constitution. Japan needs to have its own defense capabilities. Japan needs to project an image of strength and cohesion, and it needs to be devoted to protecting the neighboring countries, strangely enough, from the incursions of China and Russia. This is interesting because Mr. Abe, he attempted to develop a very strong relationship with Putin. He spent maybe 60 meetings during his tenure as prime minister. That's really kind of fallen by the wayside. So he's in a delicate position. He can't really criticize Mr. Kishida for what he's doing with Ukraine, with Russia, with Mr. Putin, because he's already seen as something favorable to Mr. Putin. So he has to be a little bit quiet and mild in his criticism, and he has. So you've got that. You've also got, the Soviet Union, and they've done missile tests, missile practices in the northern territories recently. There was a Soviet helicopter that overflew Japanese airspace 2 weeks ago. So there's always a little bit of tension going on there. There's just a lot of dynamics. There's a lot of the recipe in place for something to happen that could just spiral out of control. So there's a lot of tension and a lot of concern being devoted to that. I'd like to talk about COVID and the entry requirements. So, Japan just relaxed the entry requirements for 106 countries that it has relationships with. 106, that's a lot of countries. Um, so, it was previous that the countries who had COVID, they weren't allowed to come to Japan. In fact, most of the entry restrictions dealt with everybody, even spouses of Japanese nationals had huge difficulty coming into Japan. That's been relaxed now. We talked about, the entry requirements of 5,000 people being allowed into Japan every day. That went to 7,000. It is currently today at 10,000. So they're moving that up pretty briskly. It's not really brisk, but it's moving in the right direction. But there is concern because the numbers are not really declining on a steady pace. The numbers are not looking so great. We just finished a national holiday, and so there is some concern that because people were out, the cherry blossom viewing, drinking in the parks, that sort of thing, that there might be an uptick. So they're waiting on that. And there also is news of a different variant that has come out. So let me see, where am I? Currently, Japan is allowing people to come in who are spouses, who are diplomats, obviously, and business people who have business dealings here, but not qualifying as tourists. People who have exceptional circumstances, there's a form to fill out to describe your exceptional circumstances, and they're being very liberal in allowing people to come in there, but definitely not tourists. We're very curious about tourists, when those doors will open. There was a little bit of sunlight about 2 weeks ago. They've closed that door again, and currently the administration says there is no set timeline for accepting tourists into Japan. So they're backpedaling that just a little bit out of caution. U.S.-Japan relations are always important to us. Speaker of the House Pelosi was supposed to be in Japan this last week. You might not have known; it wasn't widely publicized. She was in the White House with former President Barack Obama, President Biden, Kamala Harris as vice president. Just earlier in the week, she looked very nice and healthy. The next day, she announced that she had COVID, so her trip was completely postponed. It's unrelated, but Mr. Biden was scheduled to be in Japan in this month, and that has been canceled as well, indefinitely. The response given by the White House is that he's so busy with what's going on in Ukraine that it's not wise for him to leave the country. Probably a good idea. Maybe we'll get Kamala Harris if we're lucky. Quad is the relationship between Australia, Japan, the United States, and India as a kind of a defensive posture to potential China incursions to Taiwan. Mr. Kishida visited Prime Minister Modi just 2 weeks ago, and under a lot of fanfare. It was his first international trip to meet another leader. Big deal. And part of his agenda was to bring India and bring Mr. Modi closer into the Quad relationship. It's difficult for Mr. Modi because all of his military capabilities, 90% of it, relies on Russian military hardware and technology. So the relationship between India and Russia is very tight. It's bolstered on what's going on globally and also regionally. India and Pakistan still have a lot of tensions going on there, and Pakistan is getting tremendous amount of their military hardware from China. So there's tension there. There's still border tensions between Pakistan and India. I don't know how successful Mr. Kishida's trip was, but as a consequence of that, two things came out in the press. One was that Japan would recognize and acknowledge the efficacy of a COVID vaccine that is issued and created in India. So they've acknowledged the efficacy there. So that means that Indian nationals can come into Japan whereas earlier it wasn't Pfizer, it wasn't Moderna, it wasn't part of the uh, acknowledged effective vaccines. So there's a relaxation there. So I think that's a concession that Mr. Modi got, but also there was an acknowledgement by Mr. Kishida of a initiative by Mr. Modi for the island countries to be collected into some sort of an economic zone. Um, it was actually launched in 2019, and Japan is only now getting around to acknowledging it and not quite endorsing it, but at least uh, in some form or manner acknowledging that it is effective and it is useful. It's a pet child of Modi, so he was able to receive that. So you don't know what the Quad got out of that or what Japan got out of that, but you can see that there's always trading of horses going on here geopolitically. The inclusion of India in Quad is so very important. It's important to the United States, it's important to Japan. So I think there's a lot of effort that was being devoted to that. We'll see how that shakes out. But in the absence of that, the two-on-two strategy with getting the defense ministers and the foreign ministers together with those 8 other countries is taking on renewed urgency. We talked about Mr. Abe and him being given the marching orders to be the poster child for constitutional revision. He is on something of a mission. He's speaking publicly about why the Constitution needs to be revised, what are the components of that, and he's speaking very passionately about the Japanese people need to have an opportunity to evaluate that possibility. And we haven't done that. We haven't done that in the diet, we haven't done that publicly, we haven't done that in the newspapers or magazines, and we should have that. And that's a setup to a referendum, because in changing the Constitution, the third component is a referendum of the Japanese people. So they're trying to prepare the ground for that. I don't know when the right timing is, either before or after the election. Probably you're going to hear much more about reforming the Constitution, because Mr. Abe is actually out on the speaking tour now talking about it. So it could be one of the components of the LDP policy positions for the upper house election. That hasn't been announced yet. They're still in the discussions of that. Something to watch very carefully. People ask me frequently, what is this deal between Abe and Kishida? How come, I thought they were good friends and they're in the LDP. They have different factions, but why can't these two get along together? And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And one of them is just, it's basically power sharing. I don't like you because you have more power than or you pretend to have more power than I have, or you pretend to be like me when I was prime minister. Anyway, there's a lot of psychology that's going on there. But you'll remember that when the election for prime minister happened, Mr. Abe didn't support or endorse Mr. Kishida. And he, in fact, didn't endorse or support anybody in his faction. His faction consists of 98 individuals. He didn't find anybody in his faction that he endorsed. He, in fact, endorsed Sanai Takeichi, and he wanted her to become prime minister. In the first round, you'll remember that she fell out, and it was Mr. Kishida and Mr. Kono who were fighting for that top spot, and Mr. Kishida got it. As a consequence of that, as a consolation prize, Mr. Abe wanted his candidate, Takaichi, to be maybe Secretary General. And that request was turned down. It first went to Amari, and that was Mr. Kishida's choice. And you might remember that there was a little bit of a kind of a scandal. There was a little bit of kerfuffle going on there, and he resigned. And when he resigned, Mr. Kishida did not put Takaichi into that position, into that key position. In fact, he put Mr. Motegi instead. So now there's a little bit of that going on. And plus, his number, Mr. Kishida's number 2 in his political faction is Mr. Hayashi, who he named as foreign minister, probably maybe the third most important cabinet portfolio in the cabinet. There's the but right now, I mean, with what's going on in Ukraine, it's turned out to be a very influential and politically sweet portfolio, because you're in the press and you're looking very diplomatic all the time. So it's really benefiting Mr. Kishida and not so much Mr. Abe. So there's this tension that's going on there, and I think it will be quiet until after the election. I think people are just really concerned about the LDP winning the election. So that's in the back seat. But I think once the election is finished, you'll see this Kishida Abe fight coming more to the fore. I'd like to end this briefing talking about the elections of the upper house. It's in July 10th. It's less than 3 months away, and a lot of angling is going on there. Let me tell you about what specifically the election is. So there are 248 members of the upper house. The upper house and the lower house is different in that when you get elected to the upper house, you have a 6-year term. It's not going to be violated. You're going to be 6 years in office without fail. It's not depending on the prime minister, whether he likes you or not. You've got it when you win it. The lower house is much different. The more than 450 members of the lower house, and they can change. They have a 4-year term, but they can change, and they frequently change because of a no confidence motion, because the prime minister closed down the house, because of some sort of a scandal. So when they change, that's a very big deal. Here, the upper house election, 248 members, only half of them, they rotate them every 3 years. So only half come up for election every 3 years. So that's the current election that we're confronting now. And in the election for 2016, the same people who ran that time, the LDP got 54 of the seats that were available. So 124, the LDP got 54 of the seats in the last election. That's not 50% of 124, obviously. So they didn't have a majority of the upper house, but in a coalition with Komeito, they were able to have a majority in the upper house. So they have pretty much a supermajority in the upper house and a majority in the lower house. In order to pass a constitutional referendum or a constitutional revision, 2/3 of both houses need to pass the language that will revise the Constitution. And then when 2/3 of both houses pass that, it goes to a referendum of the people. And 50% of the people who vote, if they vote for that referendum, then the Constitution is changed. That's all that we're building up to. So there's a fight going on now. You might have heard a little bit about it with Mr. Nikai saying the LDP must win 70 seats in this election. So 70 seats, it's a curious number. And the logic is this: although 70 is greater than 68, which would be half, he's saying that the LDP should secure 70 seats because that will give the LDP a majority of all of the seats in the upper house, including the ones who are not running. So they need to over exceed because the LDP is only in a coalition. So if they have 70 seats now, then the coalition becomes immaterial and the LDP has a majority, not the super majority that it enjoys now in coalition, but at least it has a majority. So he's kind of compelling the Kishida administration to exceed their expectations. So Mr. Kishida would like it to be understood that 54 is the bar. Below the 54, what the LDP did 6 years ago, we need to do, at least 54 in order for me to be considered to be, doing a good job. And what Mr. Nikai is saying is, hell no, that's not good enough. So he's within the LDP. He's in a different faction. So he's preparing the ground to be critical of the prime minister when the numbers don't come in. The prime minister, on the other hand, wants to say, we got more than 54 this time, therefore I'm doing a good job. Mr. Nikai wants to say the bar was set at 70. You didn't get 70, so why don't you give up the ghost and let somebody else run as prime minister? That's what this is all about. I think until we get into the election, it's difficult to say, but one of the numbers you need to keep a lookout for is this number 54 and 64. So if there's if the LDP only hits 64 seats, you will hear an amount of criticism, but some people will say it's better than what we did 6 years ago, so the Kishida administration is being endorsed. So let's move forward for the constitutional revision. I don't think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see the LDP doing far better than that. Probably not 70. I think 70 is almost mathematically impossible for the LDP to achieve. But this will be a hard fight that the LDP will spend a lot of effort on. The opposition parties, unfortunately, are not as cohesive as an opposition as they have been in the last election, in the lower house election. So it looks like there's a little bit of possibility that the opposition is actually not going to do very well this year. In contrast to that, there are two opposition parties who are cozying up to the LDP and, in fact, helping the LDP pass the economic security legislation that we just passed, and also helping Mr. Kishida with the trigger price mechanism for gasoline prices. So Ishin and the People's Democratic Party are cozying up. It looks like they could be confused with being another faction of the LDP or in support of the LDP, but a lot of the opposition parties are mad at them for crossing the line. And also, these two parties are more similar to the LDP's stance on revising the Constitution than the opposition parties. The difficulty with revising the Constitution is the Komeito coalition party with the LDP. They are against a revision of the Constitution, and without the Komeito support, who knows if the LDP can have 2/3 in the upper house and 2/3 in the lower house. So that's the trick that needs to happen. And in lining up for the election, we've got the economy that's kind of not doing so well. We've got rising prices. You've heard about the wheat prices that are going up, and the energy prices, the yen fluctuation. So it's not looking very good. There is a discussion going on, a very heated discussion about another supplemental budget to be passed to help people get over COVID, to get them spending more money. One idea is to pass this really quickly before the election, and then people will like the LDP more because they're getting more money. There are other parties that say pass that economic security bill after the election, after you have an endorsement that you're doing well, that the economy's doing well under your leadership, and push it off to there. So there are two forces, even within the LDP, that are having this discussion. One of the forces is saying we don't have enough time. We're really focused on the election. Let's focus on the election, get that over with, and then move on to the supplemental budget. And there are other parties. In fact, Komeito is pushing for this. Come on, guys, we have to work, and we have to show people that we're working all the time for their interests. Let's pass the economic stimulus package now before the election, thereby kind of diverting the energy of the LDP. People want them to be more focused on passing the legislation than focused on the election. So there's that kind of dynamic going on too. So the only other thing that I want to mention here is that we always watch what the numbers are for the various factions that make up the LDP. The Nikkei faction lost one other member this last week, Eto Seiichiro. He's decided that he's going to leave. He hasn't said where else he's going to go, but that knocks the Nikkei faction down again. It's probably the fifth defection in the last 4 weeks. So it's something to keep your eye on. Anyway, that's what's going on in Japanese politics that's hot and that's important. There are surely a lot of other things that I haven't touched upon. I'd like to open the door for questions, for remarks, for other insight that those of you in the audience might have, and let's discuss those and maybe generate a little bit more heat out of it. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Timothy. Great, crisp, and also beautiful scenery. Thank you very much for that. So could you please move to Clubhouse now, and we can continue there.
Okay.
Great briefing.
Thank you. See you in Clubhouse.
See you there. Yes,
thank you, everybody.